Hello, everyone, and good morning. Thanks for joining us here at Empty Cloud Monastery for this week's first Sutta study. So this morning we have Bhante Suddhaso, who will be sharing a sutta from the Undeclared, and you can click the link in the live chat if you would like to read along. But if you have questions at any time, feel free to type them in, and we'll address them at the end of the talk. So good morning so far to Poonam, Aaron, Elaine, Kumu, Geeta. Hello as well to Jens, Ayovimalanyani. Good to see you, Venerable. And hello as well to Kyle and Jayanta. And good morning to all those who are just viewing right now. But at any time, again, feel free to type in comments and questions. So at this time, I'll pass things over to Bhante Suddhaso for this morning's sutta.
Great, thank you. So first off, if you've already opened the website for my translation of the sutta, please refresh the page because I just fixed a couple of typos. Otherwise, you might notice the old version as I'm going through. So please refresh the page. So I'll start by paying homage to the Buddhas, and then we'll go through the sutta together. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. So today we'll be going through the Abyakata Sutta from Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 7, sutta number 54, which is translated here as undeclared. So Abyakata means something which has not been declared or not been explained. So as usual, I'll go through the sutta and read through it, and occasionally I'll give some explanations. And then at the end, I'll answer any questions that you might have. Just to give a little bit of a preview here, this sutta centers in particular around what happens to an enlightened being after they die. And the different viewpoints that people have on the subject. But it's also, ultimately it's a sutta about opinions. So I'll read through the sutta and give some explanations, and then we can talk about it some more. So the sutta begins. Then a certain monk approached the fortunate one, paid respects to him, sat to one side, and said, Bhante, what is the cause, what is the condition, because of which no doubt arises in an educated disciple of the noble ones regarding the undeclared standpoints? So this is the opening question which led to the Buddha giving this discourse. So the undeclared standpoints are, in fact, what happens to an enlightened being after death. So the Buddha never gave a direct answer about what happens to an enlightened being after death. He gives a number of indirect answers, such as saying that one cannot find any body or mind anywhere which can be said to be that being. He says that. He says that the concepts of existence and non-existence are not relevant. He says that. But when asked, does an enlightened being exist after death? The Buddha would refuse to answer. Do they cease to exist after death? He refuses to answer. Do they both exist and not exist after death? The Buddha refuses to answer. Do they neither exist nor not exist after death? The Buddha refuses to answer. So this is called the undeclared standpoints. And this is 4. There's actually another 6 for a total of 10. So these are the 4 that specifically deal with an enlightened being passing away. The other 6 are, is the universe eternal or not eternal? Is it infinite or finite? And is a being the same as their body or different from their body? But those questions aren't what's gone into in the sutta, so I won't go into more detail on those at this time. This one focuses just on the four standpoints around an awakened being passing away. And apparently this was a big deal for people at that time and place. It was, there's many suttas which deal with people who are lost in doubt and confusion around what happens to an awakened being after death, and who are very disturbed by the fact that the Buddha did not give a direct answer. There's one sutta which comes to mind where a monk basically says to the Buddha, look, if you don't give me a straight answer to these questions, I'm going to disrobe. And the Buddha's like, why did you become a monk in the first place? Did you become a monk in order to get an answer to these questions? Was that why? It's like you're wasting your time if that's what you're here for. You should be here to attain freedom from suffering, not to get answers to these weird philosophical dilemmas. So there's many discourses which involve people expressing their doubt and confusion and uncertainty around these points. So this person is saying, but I've noticed that those who are very learned in the Dhamma, who have made a lot of progress in their Dhamma practice, don't have any doubt around these points. They're not confused or uncertain around these points. Like, they're not bothered by the fact that there's no straight answer to these questions. So he's saying, why is it? Why is it that although many people are very disturbed by the lack of a direct answer, many people are very confused and uncertain about these questions, why is it that advanced Buddhist practitioners are not disturbed? Why is it that they're not the least bit bothered by the fact that the Buddha doesn't give an answer to these questions? And so then the Buddha replies. By the way, also it should be said that the Buddha said that there are 4 ways that an awakened being will answer a question. One way is by giving a straight yes or no answer. Another way is by giving an analytical answer. So carefully analyzing the question and then giving an answer which is thorough and detailed. The third way he answers a question is by asking a question in return, a counter question. Those are the fun ones. I love the counter question answers. Actually, I love all the Buddha's answers, to be perfectly honest. His categorical answers are also fun. And analytical, it's all fun. It's all wonderful. But the fourth way he answers a question is by setting aside the question. So the Buddha says there are some questions which are not to be answered. They are to be set aside because the questions are not relevant to the attainment of awakening. Therefore, a Buddha does not answer those questions. He sets them aside. And that's the case with the undeclared standpoints, is that these are questions which are not to be given a yes or no answer to. They are not to be answered after analysis. They are not to be answered with a counter question. They are only to be set aside. So again, this monk asks, why is it that an educated disciple of the noble ones, so that's Suttava Arya Savaka. So why is it that the Suttava Arya Savaka, the educated disciple of the nobles, why is it that they aren't bothered by the fact that the Buddha sets these questions aside without answering them? Why is it that they don't have any doubt or confusion because of that? And the Buddha answers, he says, monk, it is because of the cessation of opinions that no doubt arises in an educated disciple of the noble ones regarding the undeclared standpoints. So cessation of opinions in Pali is ditti nirodha. So ditti here is translated as opinion. It's commonly translated as view, which is a very literal translation. So ditti comes from the root dis, which means to see. So your ditti is how you see the world. It's your perspective on the world. So perspective is another way to translate ditti. And it's also your opinions, your beliefs, your basic worldview is all in the domain of ditti. And in the suttas, when we find the word ditti by itself, it means miccha ditti, wrong view. So there's two kinds of ditti, two kinds of opinion or viewpoint. There's miccha ditti, which is wrong view. So opinions and beliefs and viewpoints which are not in accordance with reality. And there's samma ditti, a right view, correct perspective, correct viewpoint. So that's when one's viewpoint is in line with reality, in accordance with reality. So for example, here at the monastery, in the morning we chant, almost every morning we chant the Kachanagota Sutta, which is a sutta which starts with somebody asking, what is samma ditti? What is right view? What is an accurate opinion to have about the world? And the Buddha gives a couple of very interesting answers. One answer he gives is he says, if one has the view of things existing or the view of things not existing, then that would be wrong view. But one who doesn't get caught in thinking that things either exist or don't exist, that person has right view. He also says, in defining right view in the Kachanagota Sutta, he also says that part of right view is recognizing that what arises is just dukkha arising, and what ceases is just dukkha ceasing. So all this stuff arising and ceasing, it's just dukkha arising and ceasing. That also would be right view, an aspect of one's viewpoint being in line with reality. So when he's talking here about ditti nirodha, the cessation of viewpoints, the cessation of opinions, he's talking about the cessation of wrong view. He's talking about the cessation of speculative view is another way that ditti is sometimes translated. So it's when we form some idea or opinion or belief about reality which is not based upon a direct, wise recognition of absolute reality. In other words, ditti is what all unenlightened beings are living in. We're all living in a world of our own opinions. We're all living in the projections of our own distorted misunderstandings of reality. And we take it as real. We believe that the world we're experiencing is actually the real world, but it's not. It's just our own internal opinions that we're projecting. That's all it is. So the Buddha says, it is because of the cessation of opinions that no doubt arises in an educated disciple of the Noble Ones regarding the undeclared standpoints. In other words, as one makes progress in one's Buddhist practice, one is dropping all of one's opinions about the world, all of one's beliefs about the world, all of one's perspectives and ideas about the world, which means one is able to experience the world on the world's terms. One is able to experience reality on reality's terms. One is able to finally come in contact with reality as it is. So this is, in Pali, it's called yathabhutang jnana dasanam. So knowing and seeing reality as it actually is. Knowing and seeing things as they are, rather than as we think they are, or as we believe they are, or as we wish they are. So then he goes on and he says, monk, a Tathagata exists after dying is in the domain of opinions. This is one of the undeclared standpoints, this belief that an enlightened being continues to exist after death. He says this would be in the domain of opinions. That would just be an opinion somebody might have, a viewpoint, an idea, a belief, speculation, which is not in accordance with reality. So if you have that belief in your mind, well, then you're just projecting your own wrong ideas onto the world. You're not seeing the world as it actually is. You're not seeing reality as it actually is. You've created this idea that an enlightened being continues to exist after death. But that's just an idea in your mind. It has no reflection on reality. And he says, the next statement, he says, a Tathagata does not exist after dying, is in the domain of opinions. So this is another statement. So saying an enlightened being ceases to exist when they die. That's also just an opinion that you might have, which has nothing to do with reality. The next one, the next opinion is a Tathagata both exists and does not exist after dying. And here also the Buddha says this is in the domain of opinions. And finally, a Tathagata neither exists nor does not exist after dying. And again, he says this is in the domain of opinions. So this is what's called a tetralemma. So giving 4 cases, scenarios, which is meant to cover every possible situation, every possibility. And the Buddha is saying, well, actually, none of these 4 statements is a valid statement, because all of it is just an opinion which has nothing to do with reality. It's just a fabrication of our mind. So the ordinary person, so then the Buddha speaks about why an ordinary person falls into these opinions. So he says, monk, an uneducated commoner. So in Pali, that's asuttava patujana. So asuttava means somebody who hasn't heard, who hasn't learned the Dhamma. And patujana literally means common folk, like the broad domain of people, like all the ordinary common people. So the asuttava patujana is the ordinary person who doesn't understand the Dhamma. That's what it means. He says, monk, an uneducated commoner does not understand opinions, does not understand the arising of opinions, does not understand the cessation of opinions, and does not understand the practice which leads to the cessation of opinions. Therefore, their opinions increase. They are not freed from birth, decay, dying, sorrow, grief, pain, depression, and anguish. They are not freed from suffering, I say. So here the Buddha is giving a very straightforward statement here. So you'll notice, by the way, if you're familiar with the Four Noble Truths, that the Buddha is actually applying the same framework to ditti, to viewpoints, to opinions, to beliefs. He's saying that the ordinary person, so somebody who doesn't really understand the Dhamma, the ordinary person, they don't understand how opinions, they don't understand what opinions are. So they think that their opinions are reality, rather than just being opinions in their mind. They think their opinions are reality. They don't understand the true nature of opinions. They don't understand the arising of opinions. So for example, much of our opinions are conditioned by what we hear from other people, by what we read in the news or in novels or see in movies or in TV shows, conditioned by what we learn in school, by what we hear from our parents and our friends and our colleagues. So a lot of our opinions aren't even our own opinions. They're other people's opinions that we've taken into ourselves, that we've reified in our own mind as though they were real. And some of our opinions are actually fabrications. I remember a friend of a friend was, while I was in their presence, he was saying to a friend of mine how just one day he just randomly decided to believe that his energy would continue to exist after he died. And I'm like, well, and I'm thinking, well, that's all very sweet and all, but you just like one day just randomly invented your own belief and took it on as though it was real. Like, to me, this is just mind-blowingly absurd. You just invent your own opinion and then act like it's real? Who does that sort of thing? The answer is almost everyone. Almost everyone does that sort of thing, even though it's completely ridiculous. And sometimes the arising of opinions comes from delusion and misunderstanding. We have some experience, sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, or thought, and we don't quite understand what's going on. So we form an opinion about it. We form some speculation about it. And then we believe the speculation as though it was fact. We believe our opinion as though it's fact. This is another way that opinions arise. Viewpoints, speculative views arise in the mind. So since the ordinary person doesn't understand how opinions come to be, then they don't recognize the arising of opinions, and they don't recognize the groundlessness of opinions. They don't recognize that opinions are ungrounded, that opinions have no basis in reality, that they're abstractions disconnected from reality. And therefore, they also don't understand the cessation of opinions. So how does one go about letting go of one's opinions? How do opinions arise and cease? How do they shift and change? So the nature of opinions is that they come into being based upon certain causes, as I mentioned a moment ago. But also they disappear and change when those causes shift and change. So actually our opinions, our worldview, our perspectives, they're not fixed, they're not solid, they're constantly changing. Our beliefs about the world are constantly changing. The way we think things are, it's constantly changing. So if you pay attention, you can see opinions arising and ceasing all the time in the mind. You can see viewpoints shifting and changing over time. So that also gives us a sense that our worldview is not stable, it's not persistent, it's not solid, which therefore means it can't possibly be accurate. Because if it was accurate, it would never change. And finally, he says, they do not understand the practice which leads to the cessation of opinions. And what is the practice which leads to the cessation of opinions? Well, it's the Noble Eightfold Path. Right view, right attitude, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. Did I skip anything? Was that all 8? Let's see, right view, right attitude, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. Okay, that's all of them. And you'll notice, by the way, that it actually starts with samma ditthi. So the way to the cessation of ditthi starts with practicing samma ditthi. So in order to let go of our distorted opinions about the world, you have to start by cultivating correct views, correct opinions. And you cultivate correct opinions through studying the Dhamma, studying the suttas, discussing the suttas with senior practitioners. And then you practice accordingly, which is the next 7 aspects of the Noble Eightfold Path. And so then the next paragraph is the Buddha giving the explanation of the educated disciple of the Noble Ones. So he says, an educated disciple of the Noble Ones understands opinions, the origin of opinions, the cessation of opinions, the practice which leads to the cessation of opinions. Therefore, their opinions cease. They are freed from birth, decay, dying, sorrow, grief, pain, depression, and anguish. They are freed from suffering, I say. So here, the Suttava Arya Savaka, so the educated disciple of the Noble Ones, the one who understands the Dhamma and is practicing the Dhamma, they recognize that their opinions about the world are just meaningless, groundless abstractions, which are not relevant. So they recognize how these opinions are conditioned. They arise based upon our cultural conditions, based upon our sensory input, based upon our friends and family. So they understand that these opinions are ultimately absurd and meaningless. So they practice for the relinquishment of opinions. They practice the Noble Eightfold Path for the arising of right view, the arising of an accurate perspective of reality. And in this way, then they can attain freedom from suffering, the relinquishment of speculative opinions, of distorted perceptions, and they can attain freedom from suffering, so true wisdom and understanding. And the Buddha carries on. He says, knowing and seeing in this way, an educated disciple of the Noble Ones does not declare a Tathagata exists after dying, does not declare a Tathagata does not exist after dying, does not declare a Tathagata both exists and does not exist after dying, and does not declare a Tathagata neither exists nor does not exist after dying. Knowing and seeing in this way, monk, an educated disciple of the Noble Ones naturally does not make a declaration about the undeclared standpoints. Knowing and seeing in this way, monk, an educated disciple of the Noble Ones does not tremble, quiver, waver, or become anxious regarding the undeclared standpoints. In other words, he's saying that when one commits to practicing the Noble Eightfold Path, to relinquishing all of one's opinions and speculations about reality, and instead cultivate a direct understanding of reality through the Noble Eightfold Path, then one recognizes the absurdity of making any statements about the existence or non-existence of an enlightened being after death. One recognizes that there's simply no point in doing that. It's not relevant. Reality is beyond the concepts of existence and non-existence, as the Buddha said in the Kachanagota Sutta. So again, the sutta is fixating on these 4 opinions in particular, these 4 opinions about an enlightened being after death, but you can actually apply the same thing to any opinion about reality, any opinion you might have about how people should relate to each other, how people should speak to each other, how people should act, how people should interact. So any belief or opinion that we have, it's just an opinion. It's just a belief, which means it's fundamentally absurd and meaningless. The only opinion that matters is samma ditthi. The only viewpoint that matters is samma ditthi. Everything else is just trash. It's to be discarded. So ultimately, that's what we should be doing, is we should be carefully going through our mind and examining all of our opinions and ideas and beliefs and perspectives about reality and asking ourselves, does this line up perfectly with what the Buddha taught? Does this line up perfectly with the right view that's presented through the suttas? And anytime we encounter something which does not perfectly match right view from the suttas, it is to be discarded. It's to be thrown away. And this is the path to awakening. This is one way of talking about the path to awakening, is that it's the path of understanding opinions, understanding how they arise in the mind, understanding how they cease, and practicing to let go of all opinions so that right view can arise in its place. And also I find it interesting here that he says that when one knows and sees in this way, then naturally one isn't going to make any declaration about whether enlightened beings exist or not after death. Naturally, of course not. It would be unthinkable. And again, the same applies to any other opinion about reality. When you know reality as it actually is, then you don't get caught up in your opinions and ideas about reality, because it's unmistakable. When you're eating a bagel, then you know what the bagel tastes like. You don't need to have an opinion about bagels. You just know for yourself right in that moment what the bagel tastes like. Your opinions are completely beside the point, so you wouldn't even bother with getting lost in opinions. You just eat the bagel and you know what the bagel is. Then the Buddha goes through the same analysis using different words. So first he says opinions. So saying these 4 viewpoints, they're in the domain of opinions. The next one, he says these 4 viewpoints are in the domain of craving. So this also is interesting. So to believe an enlightened being exists after death, the Buddha says that belief is in the domain of craving. So craving what? Well, some people, they really don't like the idea of relinquishing self-existence. They don't like the idea of relinquishing self-identity. So they want to believe that even if they attain enlightenment, they'll keep existing for all eternity as a celestial Buddha, as a cosmic Buddha. So I'll continue existing forever and ever as a cosmic Buddha. So where's that coming from? It's coming from the craving to exist. It's coming from the craving for personal existence. Bhava tanha, the craving to exist. Or wishing to believe that an awakened being ceases to exist when they die. This is actually a remarkably common belief among Theravada Buddhists. So I've noticed Mahayana Buddhists tend to fall into the first error, believing that enlightened beings exist eternally after death. And Theravada Buddhists tend to fall into the second error of believing that enlightened beings cease to exist after death. But keep in mind, both of these the Buddha presents as being false opinions. So some people, they really just want this whole nightmare to end. They want to cease existing. They want to no longer be subject to any kind of existence, which is called vibhava tanha, wanting to be separated from existence, wanting to be without any kind of existence. That's just another form of craving. Craving to be free of existence, craving to not exist at all. So that's also just another form of I want. I want to exist forever. I want to cease existing forever. It's all just another manifestation of self-centeredness. It's all just another manifestation of craving, me wanting something. And then the two more subtle cases, so both existing and not existing after death, and neither existing nor not existing after death. These are actually defined in the Huayan school of Buddhism. They go into a tremendous amount of analysis on these four statements. And they state that the first one, both existing and not existing after dying, is just a more subtle form of affirming existence. And neither existing nor not existing is a more subtle form of affirming non-existence. So these are still falling into the existence and non-existence duality. It's just a more subtle perspective, a more refined perspective. So it's still related to craving, the craving to both exist and not exist, or the craving to neither exist nor not exist. It's still built upon that craving of I want to be some particular way. Or it can be related to craving in the sense of wanting to have an opinion about something. I've encountered, throughout my life, I've encountered many, many people who they really desperately want to have an opinion. When somebody say, what's your opinion about XYZ? They want to be able to answer, well, my opinion is this and that. Well, who cares if you don't have an opinion? It's actually really interesting. A number of times I've had people ask, what's your opinion about this? And I'm like, oh, I don't have one. And you can just see people just shut down. They're just like, what? How can you not have an opinion? And it's like, well, do you really need to have an opinion? Do you need to have an opinion about everything? Do you need to have an opinion about anything? Maybe not. Maybe the craving for opinions is part of why we suffer so much. The next one he says these four viewpoints, existing after dying, etc. These four viewpoints are in the domain of perceptions. So in Pali, that's sanyagata. So they're in the domain of sanya. So sanya is the third of the five khandhas, of the five components of existence. So sanya is the way that we perceive things, the way that we identify things in the world. It's the process through which we label experiences. And sanya is by nature separate from reality. So there's an actual experience. Whether or not it's real or not is completely beside the point, but there's an actual experience. And then sanya is when we put a label on that experience. We put some identity on that experience. So it's always out of sync with reality. It's always a step later. It's always a step out of balance. So to be in the domain of perception, so there's a Tathagata, and then there's our opinions about whether they exist or not. There's our perceptions about whether they exist or not. But that's not the reality. It's just a perception. It's just something that's happening in the mind. It's not relevant to what's actually going on in reality. Similarly, the next one, he says that these four things, these four viewpoints, the undeclared viewpoints, he says they are a concept. So the Pali word is manyata. So there's something that you've thought up. So manyati means to form a concept about something, to form a thought, an idea in your mind. Again, it's just a concept. It doesn't have any actual reality. It's just an abstraction. And next he says these four undeclared viewpoints. He says they are a complication. The Pali word is papanchita. So you might be more familiar with the form of this word, papancha. So papanchita is, for those who are fun with Pali grammar, papanchita is the past participle form of the verb papancheti, or papancheti. So to perform the activity of complicating our experience, of proliferating concepts and ideas and opinions and viewpoints about our experience. So reality itself is extraordinarily simple, and yet we complicate it. The reality of things cannot be said to exist or not exist, but we complicate things by dragging in this duality of existence and non-existence and trying to put everything in one category or the other. That's a complication. Reality cannot be spoken of in terms of existing or not existing. So we complicate it by trying to say, well, an enlightened being exists after death. We're trying to complicate it by saying they don't exist after death. Or we're trying to make things really complicated by saying they both exist and don't exist after death. Or neither exist and not exist. So we're complicating what is fundamentally extraordinarily simple. And finally, next he says it's in the domain of grasping. So upadana. So we're trying to have something to hold on to. So this is actually quite tangible as we start to make progress in our meditation practice. Recently, somebody asked a question. They said that when they practice the perception of impermanence, when they start to recognize that there's nothing solid, then they feel fear. So as they start to get deeper into the perception of impermanence, they have this incredible fear arising in them. And the question is, why is there fear? There's fear because they want something to hold on to, and they're starting to realize that there is nothing whatsoever that you can hold on to. The Buddha says, "Nakinchi loke upadhyati." So there's nothing in the world that you hold on to. There's nothing in the world that you can grasp or cling to. So when one starts to get a clear sense of this, if you still have a wish to hold on to something, then of course you're going to feel disturbance or fear or anger or anxiety or confusion. So similarly, when one encounters the concept of enlightenment, of awakening, then you start to wonder, well, what's going to happen to me? What am I going to be able to hold on to? Is there anything I'm going to be able to hold on to? So we start looking for something to hold on to, and we find, well, this teacher over there says you'll exist eternally in your bliss body forever and ever after death. It's like, oh, that sounds great. I'll cling to that one. And this teacher says, good news, you'll just blink out of existence like you never were. Great, I'll cling to that one. So we're trying to find something to hold on to, but fundamentally there is absolutely nothing whatsoever that you can hold on to. And when we accept that completely and fully, then the mind can finally relax, and we start to get a true sense of peace and happiness. And finally, the last one is he says that these four viewpoints are torment. In Pali, that's vipatisara, so torment. These four viewpoints are things that torment us. Again, we're so desperately seeking for something to hold on to, some kind of concept or idea that we can cling to as me and mine. But all that does is just make us absolutely miserable. All that does is just torment us over and over again. So all of our opinions and viewpoints about reality that we so desperately try to cling to, we're just clinging to our own suffering. Again, as the Buddha says in the Kachanagota Sutta, dukkhameva upajamana upajjati. It's just dukkha that arises. That's all. So whatever we're clinging to, we're just clinging to dukkha. Who in their right mind wakes up in the morning and says, today I want to cling to dukkha? And the answer is nobody in their right mind does that, because only enlightened beings are in their right mind. The rest of us are not in our right mind, which is why we wake up and start clinging to dukkha right away. We're also clinging to dukkha while we're sleeping, by the way, but it's a bit harder to do anything about it during that time. So we torment ourselves with our opinions. We torment ourselves with our beliefs. We torment ourselves with our ideas of how we think the world should be, how we think people should act. how we think ourselves should act. We torment ourselves with our ideas about what we think reality is, instead of just doing the practices which lead to knowing for ourselves what reality is. So, and then the Buddha sums up. He says, "Monk, this is the cause, this is the condition because of which no doubt arises in an educated disciple of the noble ones regarding the undeclared standpoints." So that's the end of this sutta. And I think I've said more than enough about it at this point. So if you have any questions or comments, I'll be happy to go ahead and try to answer them at this time. Thank you.
Handayam Namakataya Sadhu Karam Dadamase
Sadhu, 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 anumodami.
So thank you, Bhante, for sharing that sutta with us, and good morning to all of those joining in since we started. So hello to Needham, Edward, Shui, Gurgle, Sokia, Michael, Siri Mado, Dhamma. Hello as well to Bhante Varapanyo. Good to see you, Venerable. And hello to Pial and Indira, Helen, Amaranta, and Banudas, as well as Jessica and Pete. So there are a couple comments and questions already. Michael says, this is a wonderful reminder that what we hold to be sacred, true, and necessary are mere opinions. Excuse me. And Gita says, asking if this is an accurate statement, that one must practice the Eightfold Path, and once all the path factors are fulfilled, that one abides in cessation, nibbana, and at the moment of death, one ends the cycle of suffering.
Yeah, you can speak in that way if you like. You need to be slightly careful about saying that one abides in nibbana. That statement, there is a way of saying that which would be correct and a way of saying that which would be not correct. So it depends on what exactly you mean by saying one abides in nibbana. If by nibbana you mean the cessation of greed, hatred, and delusion, then yes, that's a correct statement. If by nibbana you mean the nibbana dhatu, then that's not quite a correct statement. Because even if you've attained awakening, while you're still alive, you're not immersed in the nibbana dhatu. You still have your remainder. There's still the persisting khandhas, which exist not in the nibbana dhatu. So they're still here in the conditional world. So it's not quite accurate then to say that one is immersed in the nibbana dhatu. But my understanding is that an awakened being has a clear perception of nibbana, and they can direct their mind towards it. But it's not quite correct to say that they're immersed in the nibbana dhatu while they're still alive with the five khandhas remaining. Bhante Sumita, what are your thoughts on this?
Nibbana dhatu.
Yeah.
Yes, I think if we take the word itself, ni and vana or vana, vana is tanha or craving, right? So ni is the absence. Yes, as you mentioned, I think we have to be a little more careful in interpreting these things in mundane secular language. Maybe our language is not good enough to interpret those high-fi, lofty, philosophical ideas of Buddhism. Yeah, Nibbana is a pretty interesting subject and also difficult to interpret. Just as if you have tasted the bagel, then you can recognize it. But if you haven't, how can you actually explain it to others? Right? So as I have not tasted that, I don't know how to explain that either. So it's really tough. But through the suttas, maybe we can get some kind of an idea too.
Okay, thank you, Bhante. Okay, what's the next question?
So Jayanta asks, Bhante, can you explain what is Dhatu Parinibbana in the Buddha's last Dhamma talk?
Oh boy, I think that we actually need to have a whole talk on that subject. That's not really something which lends itself to a 2-minute answer. So I'm actually going to make a note right now to give a talk on Nibbana Dhatu, because that's actually a really fun topic. In the meantime, I can recommend a couple of books on the subject. So one is called Nibbana, The Mind Stilled, by Bhante Katukurunde Nyanananda. You can find it for free online. It's quite thick. It's a series of Dhamma talks that he gave on the topic of Nibbana. One of the most thorough treatments of the subject that I've seen anywhere. Another good book is called The Island by my preceptor, Ajahn Pasano, co-authored by another senior monk, Ajahn Amaro. So that's also a very interesting book, which goes a fair bit into the nature of Nibbana. So yeah, I'll give a talk on the subject one of these days, but for now I recommend reading those books. Those are really good books on the subject.
And Pete says, yes, it seems like people like to entertain themselves by hitting their opinions against other opinions.
Well put. Yeah.
And Michael says, I had surgery yesterday, so this has a certain special relevance for me today.
Well, I hope your surgery went well and that your recovery is swift.
And Jessica says, we do often cause suffering to ourselves and others from forming opinions and seeking not to form an opinion, but this talk is very helpful. And Pial and Indira say, so in other words, does it mean the end of all views, that is to stop clinging to the 4 types of views, clinging to sensuality, etc. By stopping that, then you have a right view?
So you're asking, if one drops all wrong view, then does right view naturally arise in its place? Is that what you're asking? Bhante Sumita, what do you think? It's so lovely having a monk who's 30 years senior to me, because I can just direct all the hard questions to him.
Yeah, I think again, like what is Samaditi? Also, it's there is a separate sutta also called Samaditi, right? And so I think we can give like one yes or no answer to these things. It will take hopefully more explanation in different viewpoints. Even in the case of the Parinibbana, like we have Sopadisesa and Nirupadisesa Parinibbana, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe Bhante can also take that into consideration in explaining what is Sopadisesa and what is Nirupadisesa.
That'll have to be part of the talk on Nibbana, because that's also not a short...
Yes.
Yeah. So that's with remainder and without remainder, which, yeah, that's not a short answer. But yeah, I would say one thing to be very careful of. So in terms of saying that through dropping opinions, then right view arises naturally, the danger with that perspective is that we might think we're dropping our opinions, but we're still holding on to some level of opinions and viewpoints. So this is why the Buddha, he talks about relinquishing opinion, but he actually, far more often, he talks about cultivating right view. So the Buddha does talk about relinquishing views, but far more often in the suttas, he talks about cultivating right view. So you want to make an active, conscious effort to build up right view in your mind. as well as an effort to relinquish wrong view. If you only practice relinquishing views, then you may or may not get deep enough in your mind to clear out all the wrong view. Whereas if you actively cultivate right view, then you're building up this internal power of right view, which will start naturally driving out wrong view from your mind. So one of the most potent ways to cultivate right view is to read the suttas. All of them, cover to cover, repeatedly. Bhante Sumita is nodding vigorously because this is exactly what he's done, probably more times than I could count. I'm lazy. I've only read through the suttas a dozen times or so. So I'm actually still constantly, actually all the time, I'm rereading the suttas. One of the really lovely things, I remember once Bhante Gunaratana, so Bhante Ji, Hene Pala Gunaratana, somebody once asked him if he still reads the suttas, and he says, oh, absolutely. I'm rereading them all the time. And every time I reread them, I learn something new. So this is a 95-year-old monk who's been a monk since he was a teenager. He's read the suttas probably hundreds of times, and he says that every time he reads them, he learns something new. That's impressive. So what that's pointing to is the power of the suttas to constantly refine our right view and to constantly drive wrong view out of the mind. So if you haven't read through all the suttas at least once, make it a priority. It's incredible how much that will transform your mind. And once you've read through them all once, start over again. Once you finish your second read through, start over again and repeat until fully enlightened. Then you can stop reading the suttas.
And Dhamma Nibbana asks, how will we be free of our habit of opinion?
So as it says in the sutta, when you recognize that opinions are just torment, at some point you decide that you want to stop tormenting yourself. And you will. So cultivate right view and recognize the torment that comes through clinging to views. So then naturally your mind will become more and more pure over time. Your views will become purified. You will come more and more into line with the Buddha's perspective on reality. Yes, Ajahn Kovilo.
So there's this list of 10 like wrong views which we shouldn't hold to or shouldn't take a stance on. And then you've got like the all types of right view, like the mundane right view and the Four Noble Truths. What about like all the views in between, like views about how the monastery should be run? So say somebody comes here and is like, I'm of the opinion that I don't need to come to morning and evening meditation, and I don't need to help out with the community. So what do you do? I mean, you're not cultivating that. How do you relate to these middling views, which aren't necessarily wrong or right, as put in the suttas?
So Ajahn Kovilo is asking about, he says you have clearly wrong view, such as the belief that you're going to live forever. And then you have clear right view, such as the belief in karma and rebirth. I'm giving my own examples here. I like to harp a lot on karma and rebirth because, let's face it, karma and rebirth is real. You can't get around it. It's Buddhism. If you don't like it, you're in the wrong religion. So, but then he was saying, what about the middling views? So, for example, somebody comes to the monastery and they have the view that they don't need to come to morning chanting, or they don't need to help out with the work period, or they don't need to be silent during the silent times. Well, I would actually say that's not middling view, that's wrong view. So when you go to a monastery, you're actually making a commitment to relinquish all of your opinions about how you want to behave. You're willingly choosing to drop all of your preferences and to just follow the monastery rules. And we do so because we recognize that all of our opinions and preferences are just manifestations of self-clinging. I want to sleep in, What is that? It's I want. What is I want? Self-attachment and craving. That's all. So you wake up in the morning and you think, I want to skip morning puja, and then you realize, that's why I suffer. And then you get up and you go to morning puja. So monasteries are actually incredibly powerful for that reason, because they do constantly force us to rub up against ways of thinking and acting which are not our preferences. And therefore, they force us to constantly examine and constantly relinquish our personal preferences and our personal opinions. I know I'm talking to the camera, but I'm answering your question. But I'm used to facing the camera.
I could hear.
Yeah. So it's not that there's anything inherently wrong about skipping morning puja, but when you're living in a monastery which has a rule of morning puja, then that is a training system which helps the residents to abandon self-attachment and craving. So it's not that sleeping in is inherently evil and you will go to hell, but rather it's that the rule is there to get you to examine your self-attachment and your craving and your preferences, and to give you support in relinquishing self-attachment and craving. So monasteries are designed to be uncomfortable. Why? Because we are attached to comfort, we're attached to our preferences, we're attached to getting what I want when I want it. So monasteries are designed to make us painfully rub up against our own preferences and realize that the pain is caused not by the monastery rules, the pain is caused by our own preferences. So I would say that somebody who rejects the monastery guidelines is solidly in the wrong view camp, not in middling view camp. Bhante Sumita's nodding again.
Actually, what comes to mind as you were all having this interaction was in the Christian monasteries, they actually use even more strong wording than in Buddhism. So for example, they, like in Benedictine monasteries, there is the submitting to the rule of Benedict. I'm literally translating from Italian. Like they talk about submission and not questioning that, which can sound quite claustrophobic in a way for contemporary sort of standards. But what I was seeing as a parallel was more in terms of getting back to the right view and no views. And a lot of times I've heard this idea that, you know, one shouldn't have any views at all. But my understanding is it's not that one shouldn't have any views at all, but actually one should adopt right view. Mm-hmm. And at the very beginning, it's actually kind of submitting oneself to the rule of the Buddha in a way, like to right view. A lot of the things sound, at least that was my experience at the very beginning, not a lot, but some of them were completely irrational to my mind. So there is that sort of component of submission, and perhaps softer wording can be taking it as a working hypothesis. So kind of putting aside your views for the time being and taking this as a working hypothesis, and then shifting your mind towards right view, right? Rather than relinquishing all views.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, otherwise it wouldn't be the first sort of step of the path.
Also, just realistically, I have met a handful of people who say like, oh, you should not have any views. We should relinquish all views. But on further investigation, it's actually that the person is deeply attached to their own views. So what they're relinquishing is right view because they don't like right view. So usually when I hear people say, oh, you should not have any views, what they actually mean is, I do not like the Dhamma. I only like certain parts of it, but I don't like the whole package of right view. So what they want is to relinquish right view. That's been my experience on the subject.
Yeah.
So I don't, whenever somebody says you should relinquish all views, that raises a major red flag in my mind, because I'm like, what you're actually saying is you don't want to accept the Buddha's teachings.
Yeah, but to a certain degree, don't we all do that until we attain awakening, in the way that there is that resistance to, you know, like the idea that this feels solid. So there are certain things that appear to us in a certain way, and so we tend to believe in it. So that's why I guess my parallel with the submission, like in the Benedictine rule and the wording that they use, in a way you are submitting to certain to what the Buddha says this is right view, and starting to kind of like start seeing the things through the lenses of the Dhamma, while also resisting, so it is an uncomfortable like sort of momentum. This is
Yeah, I mean, basically when we start Dhamma practice, what we're doing is that we're starting a war in our mind. We're introducing a body of concepts and views which are fundamentally opposite to the body of concepts and views that are already present in our mind. So that starts a war in our mind, a war between right view and wrong view. And that can be very uncomfortable at times. But as time goes by and right view starts winning out, then an incredible peace and joy starts to come up in the mind. And that's the peace and joy that comes from actually coming into tune with reality. And we realize that we've been suffering for longer than we can possibly remember, because all this time our views have been discordant with reality. And it's only with the adoption of right view that we're finally starting to come into concordance with reality. It's kind of like when you have a group of people all chanting or singing together, and they're all completely out of tune with each other. Anyone who's been in monasteries can relate to this. They're all completely out of tune with each other. And then as you keep chanting, people start to harmonize, and you get to a point where just like suddenly everyone just snaps into harmony. And we're all chanting the same thing at the same time in the same pitch. And it's just beautiful, and there's this sense of ease, like all the struggle has stopped. So that's what it's like. We've been in discord with reality, out of harmony with reality, for longer than we can remember. And as we start to practice right view, we start to come into tune with reality. We start to harmonize with reality. And there's this sense of ease that brings. So yeah, Buddhism is not about relinquishing all opinions. It's about cultivating right view, which also leads to the relinquishing of wrong view. Okay, anything else? Bhante Sumita, yes, please.
I think, yes, first of all, we have to get rid of wrong view, and then we use the right view to go to the right, liberation. And once you are there, you even leave the right view, right? Even I think there is a beautiful metaphor, a simile in Kullu Upamango Bhikkave Dhamman Desisami Nittaranattaya no Gahanattaya. So I teach the Dhamma. Dhamma is just like a raft. You can just cross it. Once you cross it, you don't take it on your shoulders. You just leave it. And even the Dhamma, you leave it behind. But that is important for you to cross. So if you say that it's not important, then you can't even cross it. So it's important, even the Sammaditthi, that right way is very important for you to cross it. Otherwise, you can't even cross it. You will be here only forever. So after that, you leave even that. So most of the time, what we do is, it's like also the simile of the snake. You take the simile in the wrong place, the snake will bite you back. So even the Dhamma should be taken in the right way. Otherwise, you will also be really like you will be puzzled in so many different ways. Yeah, I think all the the lenses that we are wearing, we have to remove and look at the world in its reality. And that way, eventually, we will be able to see the reality.
Okay, thank you, Bhante. Yeah. And we're running well over time. So if there's any other quick questions, we can give quick answers. Otherwise, we should wrap up for the morning.
Let's see. Well, Sirimedo says, can we assume that the teachings of the sutta apply to having opinions when we haven't had a real understanding, even for mundane matters?
Yeah, that would definitely fall under this, yeah. Yeah.
And then for Dushi says, how can we cultivate right view every day in life?
I mean, that's a big question, but the short answer is to constantly contemplate the Four Noble Truths, see the Four Noble Truths in effect in everything that you do. So recognizing your dukkha in every moment, recognize how you create your own dukkha through craving, recognize whenever your dukkha diminishes, and recognizing that the diminishing is connected with practicing wholesomeness and relinquishing craving. So that's one very potent way of cultivating right view, is to constantly look at your experience through the lens of the Four Noble Truths. Also practicing the perception of impermanence at all times. Incredibly powerful way of bringing you into line with right view. Also seeing all things as impersonal, though that one is a bit more advanced. It's quite a bit more challenging. So your basic ones are the Four Noble Truths and the perception of impermanence. Do that all the time, and right view will grow. And read the suttas every day.
And then the last question's from Amaranta, who says, over the years, I've understood that relinquishing wrong views is based on what the Dhamma says, but I've also seen that some people can manipulate the Dhamma and tell you to believe what they say. What do you recommend?
I recommend reading all the suttas, because then you'll know when somebody is manipulating the Dhamma or taking things out of context. I've seen that as well. I've seen people take a single sentence from a sutta and pretend it means something completely different from what it means. But when you see that sentence in the context of the whole sutta, or the context of the whole Sutta Pitaka, then you understand exactly what the Buddha was saying. Yeah, I've seen it all the time. People take fragments of the suttas and try to pretend it means something completely different from what it means. So yeah, when you read through the suttas, then you will start to understand the context for every statement that the Buddha made. So that then when you see a statement taken out of context, you'll know that that's what's happening.
Kalama Sutta also is a good practice.
Yes. Okay.
Well, there is a question here on Instagram from Prakar, but it's actually not related to the Sutta. So Prakar, if you can tune in on Friday evening at 7:30 p.m. New York City time and ask your question during one chat, there will be a panel of monastics that will be happy to answer it.
Okay.
All right, well, it seems like that's all for this morning. Thanks everyone for joining us for Sutta study. If you return this evening at 7:30 p.m., we'll have some guided meditation as well as a Dhamma talk. But until then, we can end with 3 sadhus.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.